Okay, so we're going to speak about Eris finally. I think we've spoken about this, you and me, before, actually, Andre, but I've now got a bigger theory about Eris since we last spoke about it.
Oh, good, good.
Yes, I'm adding to it as I go along. All right, so I want to just point out that it's Richard Tarnas's model that I'm following here, the idea that there is a synchronicity between the discovery of a planet and what is going on out in the collective, right? Mm-hmm. So just quickly, Uranus revolution, 1781, French, American Industrial Revolution, then 1846 is Neptune. Actually, I found something out about Neptune that's really interesting. It's associated with the unconscious, which is, of course, my big area of interest. And the first time the word unconscious shows up in a textbook is actually in 1846, which is a great little link up to what Neptune is all about. And then you go to 1930, and of course, that's Pluto and Nazi Germany and the Depression and, and the atom bomb, which is actually 15 years after Pluto is actually identified or discovered or whatever you want to call it. So then we move to 2005, and Mike Brown at Caltech and his group identify Eris. And I don't know if you know the story of the identification. He actually wrote a pretty good book called How I Killed Pluto and Why It Had It Coming. And it's actually a pretty good book because he's a scientist, but he's actually a pretty good writer. And one thing before we go ahead, I thought I'd just share the screen and show you his chart, because if you had sort of a people that would just try to match charts with what someone has done, this is, totally the chart you would expect from a person who not only actually discovers a planet, but actually is really interested in the reclassification of other planets. So check this out, right? You've got, well, you can see it yourself. I'll just point out what I noticed and maybe you can put it. So first of all, you've got all these planets here in Virgo and all the planets in Gemini, so all ruled by Mercury in Gemini. So this is like the Uber classification chart. I've never seen anything like it with all of it concentrated on two sides. But something I think you would really appreciate, given the video you just did on Putin and Saturn Pluto, is he literally has that Saturn Pluto opposition at birth, right? So he's born and that happens every 4 years. So it's not something that everybody's born with, but he has the Saturn up. And when I think about it, I think what he's saying to Pluto is no, which is what Saturn says to you. It says, no, you are not a planet. Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is pretty good, right?
That's a great point. Yeah, it's so the Saturn comes in and says, I'm blocking you.
Yeah, you're no longer classified as that, as such. But just, I don't know what this time of birth is. He's born in Alabama. I'm from my understanding, only California has published times. I don't know. It's rated as an A rating, but there's been some talk about on Twitter about you have to be careful with some of the ratings. They're not really turning out to be. But actually, if you think about it, all those planets in the 12th house make sense for a researcher, someone who's sitting and looking at the sky and trying to figure something out. So it kind of does work, but I wouldn't put my mind on it. The other thing is, you notice I don't have Eris actually on this chart because I forgot, but it would be at about 11 degrees in 1965, right? 11 degrees Aries in his 7th house. So his relationship is with this planet that he can't stop talking about. So anyway, I thought that would be interesting just to start us off. When he actually discovers or sees or sights his planet, he is immediately aware that that Pluto has to be reclassified because of the fact is Eris is as big as Pluto. Then he's thinking, well, there's going to be other planetary bodies that are as large, and this is going to be a mess. So he starts arguing at the International Astrological Union that this must be done. And there's this big meeting where they all decide to demote Pluto, which I find funny. Of course, sure, try it if you can. Demote it all you want, right?
Especially his Pluto. I'd be sitting as an astrologer and say, "Are you sure you want to do this?"
Yes, exactly. But okay, so they demoted. One of the things that I find really interesting about this idea of the synchronicity between naming a planet and the actual characteristics that the planet seems to have archetypally is that I wish some of these guys would just take a course in Greek mythology to maybe understand what they're even doing, because Eris is one of the most troublesome, as we'll get into the mythology, right? One of the most troublesome forces out there. She had a sister called Harmonia. Now, Harmony, right? Do you imagine if they've named it Harmony? I'm not so ridiculous as to think that anything would change.
Her sister's Harmonia. Is that true?
Harmonia, yes, it's
Harmonia.
Ridiculous. So he goes for Eris, and the way that I'm just going to stop sharing for a while. Then I'll go back to this. The way I read about it is that was taken with Xena. I've never seen this show, but there was a show on TV called Xena the warrior princess or something. Do you remember this? I never saw it, so I have no
I
idea
didn't
what
see
this
it, but
is
I know
about.
I know the show. Yeah, because you see those pictures on the web when if you search for
Right.
Eris, you get Xena often, as an image. Yeah.
Right. So here he is. He's obsessed with Xena. So he calls this planet Xena before he calls it Eris. And at some point he thinks, well, you have to follow the Greek nomenclature. You can't go off and give it a crazy name. So then he comes up with Eris. And one of the things he says in his book, which I just found astounding, is how that was his favorite goddess. And I'm thinking, okay, of all the goddesses, you choose the one that is associated with major destruction in the ancient world, because that is what Eris does. Anyway, so he names it her Eris. And so let's now look at.
She's in his marriage house.
It's in his marriage house.
I mean, it's not.
Well, the interesting, yeah, I know it's the whole thing. By the way, he's really attached to being the Pluto killer. His actual Twitter handle is @PlutoKiller. So I'm thinking.
By the way, it squares his sun. Did you see that too? That Pluto.
Yeah, we can bring it back up. I can bring up the chart.
That Pluto, it's quite incredible that it's not just Saturn opposite Pluto. The sun is squaring both ends.
Right. Yeah, I didn't even notice. I mean, I didn't pay attention. I was just paying attention to the actual.
Yeah, I mean,
concentration.
You could even drag. It's valid to even the Jupiter. So you get a Jupiter Sun conjunction, right. and even look at the nodes too. This is a classic. One of the things about the nodes is that if you put planets in square to them, where they're parked, you get a karmic, like the world pulls you in some direction and you become obsessed with that particular topic. And all of this is pointing to his Saturn-Pluto opposition. So it's incredibly wired in the chart.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. Now, what would you think? Like I was thinking about him, he's very much attached to being the Pluto killer, clearly, because if you're not going to name a planet, what's the next best thing? You've killed off another one, right? This is a big deal. I mean, when I was in London, it was very thrilling to be at Westminster Abbey sitting on looking at Herschel's grave, just because of the association with Uranus, right? So he's done that. What would happen now? I was thinking about this. Saturn he's about to have his second Saturn return, right? In about a year and a half, it's going back in there. So I'm just wondering, there's still a huge argument in the astronomical community about bringing back Pluto. So it would be interesting to see if at his second Saturn return, that might actually happen. Who knows, right?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with this is that, as commenting on the astrology, to me, because the synchronicity of finding something is what makes the astrology really valid, but that's not going to play well with astronomers.
No, of course not.
It's just that to me, Pluto was discovered first. That immediately grants it a special power, and Eris being the one that displaced it is the next important one. Right. Even though you'll then hear, but there are others like Haumea, Makemake, they're close to the same size. These all are around the size of the moon, by the way. They're all pretty small. Right. So then you start arguing, well, Eris is the same size as Pluto. Okay, well, that counts. But if we keep going, we add too many. Well, those are not going to be as important as Eris because Eris came in first. That's my sense of the synchronicity of astrology.
Okay, well, let's continue because I think I'm going to make an argument as to what this might mean. Karen LaGrice, who was a student of Richard Tarnas, did write a book about Eris ages ago, but I think it was too early, and I think you have to really wait. If you think even about Pluto, it was 1945 when the atom bombs are dropped that you really get a sense of how treacherous Pluto might be, right? So I'd say that he just jumped the gun a bit. So just going to what the myth is, it's associated, of course, with the Iliad, but it's associated with a really big deal that happened, and we're only starting to realize post 2006 when he actually figured this out, what a big deal this is to the development of human consciousness. And that's that in the Iliad, the story is the judgment of Paris, right? It doesn't actually show up in the Iliad, but everybody in the ancient world would have known that this is why the Trojan War happened. The Trojan War is supposed to have happened maybe in 1250 BCE. There's a lot of argument about, when you go that far, getting actual evidence for anything is going to be very dodgy. But the point about that, as you know, and I'll simplify it, is that there's the wedding of the parents of Achilles, who plays a big role in the Iliad. All the goddesses are invited, but the goddess of discord, i.e. Eris, is not invited. And there's many reasons. The myths can have many variations. So some of them say there's not enough space at the table, whatever. But the majority of the myths will say when talking about Eris, will say, the majority of the versions will say, no, it's because she is the goddess of discord, and you don't want the goddess of discord at a wedding. I would argue that that's the exact thing you want at your wedding, because the psychological principle is that if you don't invite it to the wedding, it's going to show up in your marriage, and it's going to show up twice as big and twice as nasty, right? But they decide not to invite Eris. So what happens is that she shows up anyway. She shows up with the ultimate thing, which is the golden apple, or the apple into which is inscribed to the fairest, right? Throws it in the middle of the table. The three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, fight for it. And the way they fight for it is they bribe the person who's going to make the choice. Now, Zeus is really smart. I mean, I think Zeus is probably the most interesting character. He decides, well, I don't want to choose this because I'm going to get into trouble no matter which one I choose. They're all going to get mad at me, right? One of them is his wife, who's always mad at him. So he says, okay, I'm going to pick up some sap to come in and do this. And so he finds a young man who is a prince of Troy, who's only 17. I mean, we're thinking, I don't know, in myth, you don't really have an exact age, but he's an adolescent, right? Or just out of adolescence. So the three goddesses offer their stuff. And, one offers, well, you'll rule Asia. The other one is, well, you'll be skillful in battle. And the third, Aphrodite, said, I'm going to give you the most beautiful woman in the world. Well, you kind of know where this is heading, because he's going to choose the most beautiful woman in the world. So he chooses Helen, who unfortunately is already married to Menelaus. And this is what starts the Trojan War. Now, one thing this is where it gets interesting for me. So this big war happens. It lasts a long time. The Iliad recounts it. The follow-up to the Iliad, which is the Odyssey, is the story of Odysseus, one of the players coming back home, and how long it takes him to get home. What's really super interesting, and this is where I've started, and I want to point these three books out. There is a thinking now with the brain that something happened between 1250 BCE and where we are now, or actually between 1250 BCE and even the Greek classical period, which is about 500 BC, with respect to the brain. In other words, the gods in the Iliad are very enmeshed. They're very much involved in human lives. They're taking sides. They're creating even more problems. But once you go beyond that, the gods no longer belong inside. They're kind of projected outwardly. And so the idea here is that using, especially this guy, McGilchrist, using the idea of brain lateralization, that we started developing the left brain. And the reason we started developing the left brain as a whole is because we started writing. And writing, 90% of us are right-handed. So you're developing the other side of the brain, right? As we did that more and more, now the right and the brain left do the same things, but their matter of attending, the way they attend to things is different. So the left brain sees the parts, the right brain sees the whole. Here's the problem. The right brain can see the left cannot see the right. So what's happened over time is the left brain thinks it's the only thing in town. And the way that manifests is, for example, you go to a doctor and they see a liver. They don't see that you're part of a whole system. That's just a reductionist way of looking at it. But what McGilchrist argues is that this has caused almost a low-level mental illness generally, because we're no longer able to connect. Actually, by the way, one of the reasons I love astrology, it's a connecting language. It's getting us back to myth. It connects things together. It makes you feel somehow like these synchronicities kind of bring things to life. That's not something that the general collective is all that interested, or they'll dismiss it. Anyway, these three books point to that, which is why I think the Iliad is particularly interesting. But there's another story about Eris before we go back to 2005 and what I think is connected to this. And the story is in one of the tellings by Hesiod, who's a Greek poet. She actually helps Zeus do something that is never done before on one day to get back. I'm not going to go into the details, but they reverse the order of the sun setting. It's the only time that the sun sets in the east. And it's a violation of the natural order. And so one of the things that's often been said is Eris pointing to the ecological crisis, the climate crisis that we have, right? Because 2005, if you remember, or 2006, that's when Al Gore released, that's when it really hit the consciousness, right? That
Yes.
What was the name of that film that he released? It'll come to me.
Truth.
Inconvenient Truth, right? So that part of the Eris myth is troubling, shall we say, right? Okay, so where do I think this is heading for me? Oh, by the way, here are her children. And this is why maybe he might have wanted...
These are Eris children?
Yes, so look at these names. Disputes, manslaughter, blindness. But please pay attention for what I'm going to do next, or where I'm going to connect it. Words, okay, logos, words, grievances, hardship, murders. I mean, everything is here. These are her children.
Oh, my Lord. Oh,
it's so funny. You wanted harmonia here. Anyway, so here it is. I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to posit what I think this might be related to. Okay. So if you look back, you may say, okay, 2005, 2006, you did this with Saturn. What happened, if you remember, the tsunami killed 230,000 people. There was an earthquake in, I think, Kashmir that killed 73,000 people. There was a cyclone that killed 70. It was a complete disaster. So you can say, okay, that connects to that Hesiod story. But I think there's a story we're only realizing now that might even be more connected. In 2004, a guy at Harvard creates something called face mash, right? Which is what he uses and his friends are using at Harvard to rate the women at Harvard. So just think of the Eris myth and the rating of, or the women that are involved, this contest that involves women, right? That becomes Facebook eventually. It becomes Facebook. First, it becomes the Facebook. That's what he calls it. By 2006, and a great synchronicity, in 2006, September, the month of September, Eris gets accepted as the name that planet is going to be, because I think before it was B313 or something. And in the same month, Facebook goes and is made accessible to everybody over the age of 13. Prior to that, it had only been in universities. So the reason I think this may be linked is that if you think of what evolved from Facebook, right? It's Twitter, it's Instagram, it's all of the social media. By 2016, if you follow the journalist Cadwallader, she actually documented how incredibly powerful it was used by Russian bots, by Russian money to influence Brexit, to influence the 2016 election, and eventually by 2020 to divide us even on the subject of vaccinations. That's how incredibly insane this machinery that was created then. Now, it was created with the idea of let's get together, let's talk, let's post pictures, right? But it's turned into one of the most toxic things. And actually, when you saw those words of the children, women will tell you that being on these social media sites is actually a scary thing, especially if you have a kind of a public account, because people can come in and they can, make and it gets pretty nasty, which really relates well to the story. So that is the one thing that I think, for me, yes, all this destruction on the ecological level, but I think now the last thing is that if she's not invited to sit at the table, right? Which is the story of Eris. She basically is not giving a seat at the table. The third thing you could bring into is if you think of what happened, I know that Tarnas links it to the Saturn Uranus, but you can also link to Uranus being around the idea that you start getting Occupy movements, which say, you know what, we're tired of this. We're tired of not being included. We're tired. It's not only women, it's every minority group that has always been included or excluded from the conversation. So that could be the third thing. But for some reason, I keep going back to that Facebook thing, because we didn't really see how much damage the whole social media network did until very recently, where I think it was just so exaggerated that we thought, oh my God. One thing that just came to mind the other day. So since the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, vaccine misinformation on Twitter has gone down by 90%. Why? Because all these bots have been redeployed to support Russia. And if that doesn't tell you that there's been some really bad actors involving a lot of money and a lot of people that are really jostling for power, I don't know what would. So that's where I think they're connected.
Really? Is that so? Wait a second. You're saying that since the Ukrainian invasion, bot activity has gone down 90% in relation
around the issue of vaccine misinformation. That's what somebody was reporting.
Brutal, right? So that tells you that Russia has been, this is the thing about Russia, right? I hate to say it, but they're basically constantly at war with the US. They're just they get in your face and they just do massive disinformation. The other thing, by the way, with Eris is that, just turning to that, is that it's no surprise for the US because it's now locked into a square to Mercury and it moves so slow that it's not getting out for years. No,
well, of course, that's a problem with Eris in general. I know. Yeah. I think though with the issue of the US and this, it wasn't only actually the US. Do you remember that whole Catalan separatist movement in Spain? That's fueled by Russia today, by the way. At some point, something changed. We're Spanish. We know what goes down there. There's always been, I'm Gallego and whatever. But something really, really mobilized around 2011 or whatever. And they started seeing that the top things being shared were coming from Russia today, which we all know is the ultimate, organ of misinformation coming out of Russia. They've been involved in that. They've been involved in the yellow vest strikes in France. It's not, and Brexit is a clearer involvement. I think part of the problem is that Russia pays off a lot of people, including politicians and movements, and the Catalan movement might be one of them. I don't know that one particularly, but I do know in England, there's a lot of conversation about how many politicians, including the guy who led the charge, Nigel Farage, right? He is definitely connected to Putin. So if we don't reform our political systems, I really don't know how you're going to fix this. And this is a problem that may take, a long time, because power, once it's concentrated, you're not going to get it away from people. Sure. But yeah, that is, for when it started affecting public health, I think you start thinking just how nefarious this whole thing is, right?
And
Not that you didn't know before.
I wonder with Eris, when they, the ultimate sign that it'll get connected to, because if you say environmental, then you would look for maybe some kind of a Gemini Sagittarius as the environmental signs, the near environment, the far environment. You notice that people that are into, like Al Gore with the weather thing, the warming, he's got his planets cutting across 3-9. So he's,
interesting.
in fact, he's an Aries, which is hot, with Neptune opposite, and 3 to 9. That's, global warming. it's remarkably accurate, right? But with Eris, if you say that, you do take away the other feature, which is, if you think Facebook, and especially the relationship to women and relationships, period. Like, my feeling is that Eris may be the co-ruler of Libra. That's the suspicion I have right now.
Yeah,
and if people say, "Oh, well, Libra, that's a nice energy," really, let's talk about Putin. It's not clearly, or Libra is a cardinal sign.
It's masculine.
Yeah. So it's a possibility, but we'll see how it shakes out as time passes. But it's pretty clear, though, what you're bringing up, that there are all these different levels where it's affecting multiple really important things at the same time, and it's literally creating that discord, that chaos.
Oh yeah, but I mean, think about the words, right? Where is this chaos playing out? It's playing out on social media. Before, you and I could have a conversation, it would be limited to us, but suddenly this conversation is happening in public with people commenting who you don't know, and maybe whoever they are, they're hiding behind pictures. We don't know who they are. And so, this is something we have. And of course, there are no controls over it, because no one is willing to step up and say there has to be some sort of controls about, even whether when you go on Twitter, maybe you do need to give a license, a driver's license, or prove who you are. But those engines or those organizations don't want to do that, because it will limit how many people get on their sites. So it's a kind of a insane situation. It's only in governments. I think the EU, which is generally way ahead of everybody, is going to start doing that. They're going to start imposing some restrictions. And frankly, Attica, when everybody says about free speech, you need some responsibility being taken as well. You can't just have unfettered everything, right? And so I'm hoping that will happen. But right now, I don't see anything. I just see more discord, more insanity. And
and you could even, another cyclical relationship is that if you were pointing to the most discordant years, aside from, for example, the Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn conjunction. So there's lots of, there's astrological evidence that it correlates with the pandemic and so forth. But they didn't mention Eris in that account. And Eris is square those. And the thing that is most incredible is that Eris has been squaring Pluto. And that happens very rarely, right? Because when these two planets separate, Pluto will move slower, Eris moves slower. Pluto, despite its generally slow speed, it'll take off and it'll leave it there for forever, pretty much, right? And it just turns out that now it's there. And I thought to myself that the pandemic is also explained by Pluto square Eris, not just the idea that it's the other three planets. Because if you think about it, Pluto squares Eris for everybody. It's the entire planet. You don't point to a country and say, "Oh, this country's getting," no, everybody gets Pluto square Eris. So it's this conflict between those two. And wouldn't that also be the conflict between the plutocracy, Pluto, and Eris, which is the discordant force that says, "No, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to fight you. You've left us off the table. We want a piece of the action." So you get turmoil, tremendous turmoil, because the plutocracy, the idea is that they've built this power and they don't want to let it go. This is Putin's game. It's very clever. They had lots of practice during the Soviet Union, and they're now perfecting it. He was part of that whole structure, so he's just using it. And the really sad part is how everybody buys into it. Like, one of the things you're told always on social media is don't respond to the troll, right? Ban them or banish them if you have an account, but don't get engaged with them, because that's what creates more of it. But it's human nature to actually just jump on and try to argue with somebody. And during the whole vaccine thing, I mean, it just got scandalous, right? What you were seeing, the level of misinformation, the level of vitriol, the attacks, the irrational attacks on people. It's crazy. I don't know how you fix it. I mean, maybe Eris is so slow moving. I mean, isn't Eris in Aries till 2048 or something? So we're not going to get rid of it. Eris doesn't get out. It's for many years, decades. It'll take, I think it is about that 2040 or 2050. But Pluto
will move out.
The year that Pluto gets close to Aquarius, first of all, already that's signs that align. they're not square anymore, and they're no longer, I mean, it's pulling away. It'll keep moving. And so then I think about another thing. Pluto rules vaccines. Vaccines were discovered when Pluto came online. It makes perfect sense because a vaccine is the idea of you're introducing a small poison to immunize the entire system.
Right.
I think vaccines are brilliant. They solve so many problems, but probably that square is in large measure responsible for why worldwide there, because you'd probably say that it's been the West, but
no, it's been everywhere.
I mean, because I heard Russia too. In Russia, they had problems.
In Hong Kong. Do you see the latest data out of Hong Kong? They're having, I find this actually hard to believe. Their older population did not get vaccinated properly, and their death rate is, because of course the older people in the population will always be more vulnerable. They're seeing much higher death rates than you would expect. So they had been free of it, but again, and you see like country to country comparison. New Zealand was brilliant at managing this. I think they have 62 overall deaths, from COVID. So when I hear people talk about this, it annoys me and I get angry, but you think, okay, this is where we're at. We just have to move on. On the issue of Eris squaring Pluto, if my theory is that social media is very much involved with this whole Eris thing, then it is social media that was fueling all of that craziness around vaccines, right? It was people were looking at Facebook and deciding that they were getting their information from whatever their trusted sources are on Facebook, like their uncles or whatever. And that was what was really fueling it, right? So it actually does make sense what you're saying, Eris and Pluto. Now, Pluto gets out of Capricorn, 2025, is that right? Around that time?
Fully. I mean, by 24, I think it makes a dip to Aquarius, but you really shouldn't count it until it's fully out.
Right.
And I think it's 25 when it 25 is it's full. Now the other thing too is that the social media does fit, because you could, strictly speaking, you'd say social media would be again more of a Gemini Sagittarius thing, third sign, maybe the 11th, you would go to the 11th. But even if you said Libra, or just the general nature of Eris, it connects to relationships. I mean, it's obvious as that.
Sure.
So as soon as you say social, you're in that realm.
Right.
The other thing too is that, curiously, it would be that Eris and Pluto, in a way, get into this runaway battle, and they completely overwhelm the Saturn. Saturn would be the idea of put on a mask, create protection, cover yourself. It's simple. I remember talking with scientists, and all I said to them is, okay, let me just try to understand something. Is it true or is it not true that at a point, at the worst possible moment in the planetary invasion by this horrible thing, if everyone had just put on a mask, what happens? The virus dies because it can't transfer from one person to another. This is what it is. It's a transference, which again is a social thing. We're not talking about a mysterious thing that can't be traced. It's traced by the fact that it's airborne and moves across. Right. Otherwise, it has no place to go and it disappears. Right. So this is like violating Saturn in the worst possible way, because Saturn would say, create a defense. Block it,
Right, of course.
Yeah.
So with respect to, because of its bizarre orbit, it's about 558 years, and it seems to, it's right now in the sky, the furthest away it'll ever be from the sun, right? It moves a lot faster opposite, and Libra would move really quickly, but it moves very slowly. Hasn't it been in Aries since 1928 or something crazy, like really early in the 20s, it went in, and it won't leave for so it stays in Aries for about 120 years. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So here's a question. So on a like level of a personal chart, something that moves so quickly would have to have a very small orb, wouldn't it, for it to actually be operative in a person's chart? No or yes?
Yes. That's true in transit. Yes, for sure. Yes. In fact, I can verify that in my own chart, because it turns out I get affected by Eris. But yeah, the orb is tight. The problem is that because the orb is tight, God help you when it finds you, right? It better be, it better be a useful, like this is the thing about Trump. He just can't get out of Eris now. And it's so ironic, because what he's done his whole life is major Eris violations. This is the way the man has lived, right? Yeah. And now, an astrologer would have told him, look, it's sitting there parked in Aries, and when you reach your 70s, this thing is going to lock in and it's not going to let go. You'll be 90 of more before it lets go. And because it's part of a T-square, and all these things that he's done that reveal Eris, like the class women pageants. Pageants are Eris. It's this thing where the dark side of Eris, when you're doing cutthroat competition about who's more pretty, right? You said earlier, Aphrodite won that battle, right? So it's about, so it descends into that. However, just because they made the choice, the young man or whoever chose it was the young man that chose.
Paris,
Of course he was going to choose her, obviously.
Of course.
Right? Okay, so like, right, because if it's someone different might have said, no, we should go for wisdom. But the point is that it's still there. So Eris holds the promise of Juno's point of view and Pallas Athena's point of view, which is the wisdom and maybe the idea of status, social adjustment, social responsibility even. I mean, you have to give that to Juno. You wouldn't give that to Aphrodite, right? So that would be helpful. But yeah, no, the idea of in Aries, first of all, it's been in Aries since the 1920s. Interestingly, when I looked at this, I noticed that the women first were given the right to vote when Eris was really late in Pisces and was coming online in Aries, but it took them 60 years to actually vote differently than men. Because the whole idea is that if women aren't voting differently than men, then they're not bringing in their point of view to the extent that you expect. And that started in the late 1980s, which if you notice, that's why from that point forward in the US, the vote has always been Democratic. Whenever Republicans win, they win by through the Electoral College, not by vote count. And the vote count is tilted blue because of women. Clearly, they're voting that way, right? So yeah, Aries. Okay, so it's in Aries from 1927 until Taurus 2048. That's
right. So I should add one thing though. I mean, every archetype has to have a light and a dark, right? So there is an actual, believe it or not, a positive side of Eris, which is mentioned by Hesiod. He actually had two Erises. He said there are two of them, which you can always say, well, there are two faces to this archetype. And he talks about, and this is so true in the arts, given that this is where I come from. And I saw it with Will, my oldest son, when he went to a high school that was an arts high school, and he studied film. And one of the things Hesiod makes a comment about Eris is that competition actually helps you because it makes you better. Yeah. So let's say, generally, if it's healthy competition, right? Now, I noticed something interesting. When Will was in competitive sports and he was playing at a pretty high level, that kind of competition was Eris level insanity. I mean, the parents were screaming at the kids. It was ugly. I didn't like it at all. But then we moved into, when he went into that arts high school, the two people that ran the film program, and these kids were competing for prize money. I mean, Will won $500 one year, Canada Film, because the film industry really supports this school. But what they tried to emphasize to the kids is it's a collaborative effort. You cannot make a film if you don't get all the kids involved. So they would help each other, and they would come to our house and be making the films. It was in a great environment. So I see that level of competition, that idea that pushes you forward, because excellence will push you forward, as the right or not the light side of Eris, or the positive side of that archetype. And I think we have to talk about that, because even with Pluto, we can talk about transformation. It's not only you're taken to the underworld, there is a challenge. And I think if we don't talk about it, it's going to sound like chaos and destruction,
for sure. I mean, because think of the logic. If you are doing anything, whether it's in sports, which may fit the archetype a little bit better, but then anything you do, it could be business, could be you're studying a subject. Of course, you're not doing it in a cave. You're doing it in society. You're aware of what other people are doing, and the notion of saying, "Okay, I want to reach this other person's level, or I want to emulate, or I want to." Yeah. This is how it works, and that can be, provided you keep it in perspective, right? If you then let it become ultra dominant, then it wouldn't be so good. And the whole idea is, as soon as you say cutthroat, then it's like it's just you're taking no prisoners. That probably isn't good. Right. But if you extract the gem, that's totally true. And this is where it is. If it's the sister of, isn't she the sister of Mars?
Yeah, she's the sister of Mars.
So then, that immediately connects it to Mars, Mars energy, which brings that principle in. Mars is competitive as well. It's a very physical planet. So yes, I would say that's one of the better ways to interpret it. You heard my theory of the three parts? One of the theories that I have, if you go with the logic you've expressed in the past about how through Jungian psychology, you discover everything in yourself. Everything is really in you. So all these, forces, when you bring up, doesn't matter, Juno, Pallas, these are all things that somehow are part of you. So then you say, there were three forces, right, at play. And as soon as you say three, in terms of, if you're thinking about a love triangle, that wouldn't be good. That would be misplacing. not good, not good. But if you said three is the 369 series, that there's a promise of harmony. If you can harmonize, there are three things happening. So Juno, Pallas Athena, and Aphrodite represent a person's drive toward their place in society, Juno. And then, yes, of course, you can then descend into the dark side with too much status and all of that. But the place in society is your job, your career, what people will know you for. There are all sorts of positive manifestations of that. Then you have Pallas Athena would represent, at least in some sense, the search for wisdom. You're searching for something, some knowledge, some understanding, life philosophy, all of that stuff. That seems obviously really important as well. And then Aphrodite, and that would be the way, but that's probably logos, right? Logos. Right, yeah. And then Aphrodite, you go to Eros, it's the love principle and all of the different permutations and combinations that can bring in, but it's obviously a really important thing as well. So then, in a way, it's signaling to you that this planet requires some kind of balancing act, which this is where maybe it is Libra, but maybe not. Even if you don't bring in Libra, then you're trying to balance three principles, which doesn't fit Libra because Libra is two, but whatever. Just stay with me for a second. So then you go, well, there's three. So then the logic is, if a person can figure out how to balance or somehow harmonize, maybe that's a better word, the three principles, then their life takes on a happy order. And you notice that many times when people go to courses, they'll draw those wheels where they say, well, okay, how many points do you give to your relationship? Like, oh, 2, and then, but I'm getting 8 in the whatever area. And you can even bring, by the way, the physicality of, because it's connected to Mars, perhaps it's the Pallas Athena, because Pallas Athena is a warrioress as well, right?
Yeah.
So there's a bit of an...
Yeah, she comes fully armed from Zeus's
right.
head.
So in other words, this is where, in that sense, you could say, just like, for example, Pluto at the beginning, nuclear power, everything is disordered. It's really scary. I mean, the first 15 years, you're running for your life from Pluto. Maybe this is the way all planets work at the beginning. But then the logic would be, as time passes, perhaps this will lead to greater awareness where humanity starts to realize, there are these forces in me. I need to balance them, and good systems, good awareness can come online where that could happen.
Okay, so 2 things about that. The number 3, of course, is really big in fairy tales because it's a number of transformation. Really, 2 just knocks against each other. The 3rd allows movement forward. So it's often actually associated with the masculine principle in that sense. You need that to move something ahead, right? And the issue of the way I teach this, because I'm interested in storytelling, most of the people in my group are actually artists. And the way somebody pointed out yesterday, that whenever I try to get them to think of 2 planets in contact with each other, I always go, tell me a story. Because you have to, the story evolves from, because it can be many different stories, they're multivariate. And so I want to hear, well, what's your story on, let's say, Pluto Venus? And I was thinking that the reason, you can almost look at it as a musical score, right? So I'm a big fan of Wagnerian opera for this one reason, that he introduced the concept of a leitmotif to his, or a leitmotif, however way you want to pronounce it, into his operas. And this is exactly around 1846, by the way. He was working when Neptune came on to the unconscious comes online, right? And what he would do, which was really clever, is the singer is singing something and you're hearing him sing or her sing, but in the background, he created these little pieces of music that will tell you what they were thinking as opposed to what they were actually singing. Now think about this, just stay with me as a metaphor for how this works, right? So think of an astrological chart as a musical score, right?
Right.
You're born with Pluto square Venus. That's a pretty hard to combine. The story there is somehow you have to bring your capacity for relationship and the fact that you get taken to the underworld every time you do try to relate. Okay, so then it shows up in a musical score. Here's the brilliance of what Wagner did, specifically with one particular opera called Tristan and Isolde, where he uses one motif to describe the yearning that these two have for each other, which will never get realized in life. They have to die before this gets realized. So he has this motif show up 100 times, but every time it shows up just a little bit differently, right? It sounds just a little bit differently. And that's the way I look at an aspect, that every time that Pluto Venus gets activated, you're no longer the same person. You're older, you've gone through some experience. So it's still there. That's still the same piece that's kind of working in the background, but somehow it is transformed, right? Completely. Right. And in the end with Tristan and Isolde, they have to die. In a way, these are never resolved. You're going to die with these imprint that you had, but somehow in those 100 repetitions or whatever many repetitions you had, you were able to get some space, right? So that when you were driven into the Pluto Venus story, you may have been able to say, okay, I can step back just for a second and maybe not go to the underworld this time. You still go to the underworld, I think, but you'll just have more consciousness around it. And I think that's where Jung was really, and that's why he was interested in astrology. And my big interest is alchemy as well. He was interested because he understood the alchemists were just depth psychologists before psychology was really articulated, right? So he would say the real problem is not, it's that we're not talking about different gods being inside of us, right? Because what's happened is we decided there was one God, and then we stopped. And so when someone gets into a depression, they think, oh, I'm going to die, because they're mistaking the part for the whole. Whereas if you can teach people to say, well, no, your Venus is kind of afflicted right now. Maybe you need to talk to that part of yourself. Then there's a bit of understanding, right? And this is what attracts me to this whole thing. It's that archetypal psychological level where, and I think it's being forgotten by a lot of the neuroastrologers because they kind of want to leave Liz Green and all the people doing the work in psychological astrology. And it's too bad because it is so powerful, right? In terms of what it can teach you about yourself.
Totally. I mean, when you think about what you're saying, what was coming to mind immediately is think of someone, suppose someone has Pluto, you said Pluto Venus, right?
That's an example.
So suppose a person has Pluto Venus. Well, the darkest end of that would be the power principle. Pluto is not developed enough, so then there's the relationships can become really unbalanced, and one person is controlling another, and then that can lead to the torrid love affairs that go sour, and then you have to discover your power and all that kind of stuff to not let it happen again. But the idea is that the person has this pull toward expressing Pluto Venus. And so in a way, what they're saying is Pluto is intensity and Venus is love. So then they'll seek for whatever they understand at that point. And if they get it wrong, they get more suffering, then transformation happens. But then picture that person, for example, could be in the reflecting the young, is it Paris? What was the person's name?
Paris is the educator.
So he's at that stage where he's more likely to get zapped by Pluto Venus, and then he goes off on an adventure. And then he ages 10 years, 20 years, and he reaches a point where he thinks, this doesn't work. Doing it this way is a really bad idea. But he still has it inside. So maybe as he gets wiser, he's able to then bring in love for humanity. Venus is still love. So now you get it to a much higher level, and you produce better results because people can be elevated rather than torn down. So it's sort of the logic that it never goes away. If you've got Pluto, whatever, it's always there. Your task is to transform it to a better level. Which this links to what I often say to people with reading charts. The charts are not fixed.
No
charts. The part where you have an input will transform those planets and allow them to express in better ways, which therefore affect your fate, which presumably will improve because the planets, they're wiser, they're more together, they're more balanced and so forth. So that makes perfect sense.
And I love what you said about Pluto Venus, because one of the things I've noticed with doing charts is that a lot of artists have Pluto Venus. And one of the ways they resolve that square or that opposition or that conjunction is through making art. That's one of the best ways. Or actually, by the way, even if you're not an artist, you can see certain artworks that will appeal to you because you have that Pluto Venus, and it helps you process whatever that emotion involved with that. It's hooked onto it, right? But you never really fully resolve it. And actually, Jung said the same thing. He said, you never fully resolve a complex. And I've tweeted this out before, and people get angry. They go, well, what do you mean? It's like, okay.
Well, I'm condemned. I'm doomed. It'll never happen. Yeah,
well, it does. You never do, but as Pema Chodron says, you can get space. That's all really you're looking for.
Well, right? And the thing is, the other thing is that it's a little bit like people pondering ultimate realities and the idea of being comfortable with uncertainty, right? And not thinking this is terrible. Why is that terrible? It's just a mind adjustment where you simply adjust. So then it's the idea that I remember the Sufi master Pir Vilayat used to say, it's like an infinite regress. It's way, it's always pulling you. Yeah. But that's how things develop. That's the idea that in a way, perfection is the enemy of the good. You can go along and you can get closer and closer. And of course you can get much happier than you used to be by harmonizing these principles rather than being completely overwhelmed by some Plutonian thing or some, I mean, think of when you think of imagining Putin's mind, he's completely captive of that really dark side of Pluto, where you've got this idea that if you oppress other people and you have all this power and
No.
and all this craziness, that this somehow is good. It's not. It's horrible,
No,
right? The
no,
idea
but
is
that's
to-
a low level living out of a principle that was some consciousness. See, well, what Jung said was at the end of the day, things go much better for you if you're more conscious. That's just why you do this work, right?
Yeah.
It's not about anything else, that you will actually live a better life. Not that you'll have more success, not more that you'll have find the perfect partner, but you yourself will be able to engage with the world in a way that is not filled with strife and bitterness. And you'll stop hurting people as much too, by the way, which is the real reason to do this stuff.
Well,
so
you know, and by the way, see, this is the thing yes, it's true that it doesn't guarantee anything. It's just that when you become more conscious, the idea is that all the principles express more harmoniously, and your odds, if you say life is like a system of odds, they also dramatically increase, that you will be more successful because
Right.
you'll have more common sense, more wisdom,
yes,
to make better choices. This is natural. I mean,
Yeah.
they go together. Otherwise, then you say, well, no, really, all this progress is only for some spiritual thing where you can sit in the corner and space out, and
yeah.
then you're happy, but you're totally broke. That's not how it works.
No.
Typically, because you live in the world, you have a better mind, you're more settled, you make better choices, you then have more prosperity. And I would even go further and then get into the with Jung, it would be the sort of the numinous quality of Neptune, where there's mysterious, you could call it almost like a magnetism that changes, and it literally changes your fate, so that things happen that reflect your new harmony versus before they were reflecting your old harmony. So all of that is good, and it's totally true that it's consciousness.
Actually, Jung actually said, whatever you don't work within you, you will experience outside as fate. And if that doesn't scare the hell out of you, I don't know what will at the end of the day. Now, here's a question for you. Are we both totally into this, the word responsibility and wisdom, because we're both Capricorns? With Saturn as a ruler, I guess. Because sometimes, the reason I'm asking, Audrey, is there'll be a dinner table conversation. Of course, I'm always get serious, and some of them are like, what? So I'm wondering if also our predisposition to this language and to this way of seeing is also actually part of the map that we carry. It could be, right? It's a possibility.
Wait, but which part? You mean, like, are you saying we're overplaying the Pallas Athena? Like, what angle are you?
No. I mean, the emphasis, for example, for me, the word responsibility is huge, right? Because it seems to me that what's missing often is the ability, freedom is great, but if you don't have the responsibility, then I just don't, it doesn't make sense to me. That's a Saturn word, right? So your Saturn ruled, it could be that it's part of that whole story.
Sure, but I mean, the thing is, okay, so the word contains response and ability. You have the ability to respond. What are you responding to? You're responding to a situation in the wisest way, so you won't get in trouble. A lot of this is, if you reduce it and say, well, why do people do anything? They're trying to stay safe, and they're trying to, in some way, make their life easier. The reason you should be responsible is to respond properly to things. It's not that complicated. It's not because your master or your teacher told you so. It's because you would do that if you had any common sense, which is also a very practical word. And by the way, Saturn is exalted in Libra, which is a relationship sign. So this is what we're doing all the time. It's not just, I'm restricting myself for no reason. No, if you restrict something, it's because you realize it's better to restrict it than not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
It's my way of looking at it as well. There you are.
Yeah, exactly. So, great. This has been wow, what a ton of information. But I think the bottom line would be that Eris, even though it's way out there, very far away and moving really slow, it's super important. It's also true that you can always, with a planet like this, if it's in your chart, it never does anything, by transit, because it disappears forever. There is the solar arc measurement that I can attest to from personal experience, definitely has effect. This was one of the things that Stephen Forrest pointed out, that you could solar arc it, so you can find out what the effect is in your chart.
I haven't tried that with mine. I will.
Yeah, it's important, because often you don't get any connection. In my own case, I can actually trace it in transit, because it's done a number of things in my life, because it caught different important points. So, but yeah, it's a super important energy. And I think the thing we didn't talk about a lot, but maybe you could say a little bit about this too, is the notion that if you think about Pluto was discovered in 1930. So in a certain way, isn't that going to make the plutocratic element ascendant and perhaps move us into a world where that's sort of the accepted thing that's happening? Now Eris is coming in and challenging that. And so the idea that feminine power is rising, and you can see this if you look at the 2005 period and forward, there are all these markers that are pointing in that direction. World leaders, more world leaders that are women, more women in politics. In fact, that's one of the side effects, the good unintended consequence of Trump is that he drives women into government because they're so upset. Right. But so then it's ascending, and the notion that as time passes, that to me would be one of the hopes, because I think it's very unbalanced. You think plutocracy, you think male patriarchy, paternalistic, behavior that I think it's exhausted. It's just totally exhausted. Like what's happened to the world that way is almost a form of madness,
Okay, so let me tell you why I think it happened from the mythological side. I forgot to mention this, but it's actually really crucial about what happens with the Iliad, right? Which, of course, is what's involved with the judgment of Paris. The first thing that happens, and I think it speaks to why it's related to the feminine principle, is the Agamemnon, who is the general, who is the brother of Menelaus, that Helen was his wife, so they mount an army to go to Troy. Their ships won't sail because Artemis is angry at Agamemnon because he's killed one of her sacred stags. So he's told by a seer, the only way those ships will sail is if you sacrifice your daughter, who is about 17 at this time, 16, same age as Paris. Now, just listen to this. And by the way, George R. Martin fans and the Game of Thrones fans, he's a brilliant reader of myths and history, and he incorporates this all into that series. So what he does, which is unbelievable, is he lies to the wife and the daughter, and he tells the daughter, get dressed for your wedding. You're marrying Achilles, who is the big hot guy, right? The Brad Pitt of the era. And so they dress her up. The wife and the daughter go to the marriage, and at the last moment, she is basically sacrificed, murdered. The way that is interpreted in the Jungian world is that is the beginning of the murdering of the feminine principle, which, by the way, is not gendered. It doesn't belong only to women. It belongs to both of us, but it is the principle of relationship, right? Relationship, connection. Right. And of course, you need to almost murder it so you can build that left brain in a way. But it is so extreme, right? That what is happening, and Jung's whole work and von Franz and all the people that followed him was, they were exhorting you have to rescue the feminine principle. You must, because if you don't, it's totally catastrophic. I think it's hair-raising that the last thing that Jung left just before he died was a record of what he thought the last 50 years on Earth were going to be. And he said, oh, there's still some life somewhere. I don't know where these 50 years begin, but you think to yourself, okay, even metaphorically, if you don't do this, it's going to lead to sheer catastrophe, which we've seen, right? I mean, you can't look at the environment and say that we haven't done something horrible. Yes. So the sacrifice of that feminine principle is at the heart of it. And while I see women going into politics, and I'm glad for it and whatever, I don't see the feminine is as an archetypal principle yet being given the due that it has to, because the feminine as an archetypal principle says, look, I sit with you at the table and we figure something out. We don't scream at each other. I don't try to lord it over you. That is not given a lot of attention, or it's not a way we're approaching things. So what we have to work on collectively is bringing that into the conversation. And I don't know how we do that when everybody's screaming at each other across, that we talked about this before when we talked about Venus. I just don't see how it's done. I think the only way to do it, and Jung had this answer, and that's why I think the personal chart's really important. Work on it in yourself, and then you're not going to pull this on anybody else. Correct. And that's really the final thing about the chart, right? If you know these forces that are at work in your psyche, you'll work with them, so at least you don't damage somebody else. You don't project it. You don't, find an enemy everywhere where really the enemy is within always, because you haven't worked that out. So that's right. I think that's the only answer, right? Yeah, that's true. That's entirely true, and it actually fits really well with. The feminine principle is the yin principle in the yin yang polarity, and it's the idea that, for instance, when you're meditating, you are receiving, and you're just there. Feminine in a way is being. Right. The male principle is active. Right. So the way you can deploy both in meditation is the active side is where you do the physical work to allow that receptive energy to be more clear, because sometimes if you try to sit and meditate, there's too much restlessness. So you use the male principle first, then you receive energy. But that what it's doing is you're in the space that's actually deploying the right brain. The right brain is that which knows things without naming them. It's nonverbal, right? So in a way, if a person said, well, what is meditation? Meditation is spend a few minutes and just go into the nonverbal place,
which means anything that comes up that's verbal, you just say, I'm ignoring that. I'm letting it go for now. And the better you get at that, the more the right brain is deployed, which is your receptivity, which is your female nature.
Yeah,
It doesn't matter if you're male or female. Both genders have access to that. So you could say this links to, for instance, people that have said, if more people in the world spend time meditating, spend time in being, the world would improve, because you would get away from that insanity of the aggression, the disharmony of the
right. Yeah, and you see that in mindfulness studies, by the way. I mean, this is what you see over and over again, because you change the actual brain. I mean, that's been documented, and you see in the actual change in behavior of the person doing it. So, which is where the proof is. So, absolutely. Well, that's Eris for you. We'll take on another one.
That's Eris. Yeah, we'll have to go to the next myth and the next one. And
well, this is really fun though, because it flushes out the world. Like I said, mythology connects the brain in a way that. If you talk about, the facts are there and you should never ignore them. I think you can have the biggest problem people get into with this is I love science. I loved reading How I Killed Pluto, that book. It was a lot of fun because you watching all those science documentaries, it's not an either or. You can love both of them. They don't have to exclude each other, right? But what I generally find in the culture is as soon as you start speaking mythologically, people shut down and say, oh, that's just it's like, okay, all right.
I covered that in my class today, the astrology class, that the synchronicities are staggering. I mean, any scientist with even a small modicum of openness would say that's pretty strange that you would get the naming of it by someone who never even followed it up, who had Pluto under his sun at the time, who was born with Pluto. I mean, it's staggering, and it keeps repeating, and especially the craziness of naming a planet and then having it act out what you named it, because you could have named it anything else.
I know.
It's unbelievable. So it's very
well,
rich.
I think they're missing out half the story, and I feel like it enriches the world as well, enriches my world. So to me, it's like, okay, you can be open or you can't be open to it. I find it is connecting, and it explains a lot. It explains a lot even within, especially for the individual. I think it is of some comfort to know, right, that there is something that awareness can help you along the path. If you are aware that you have Saturn square the sun or whatever, there are some things you can do to make that easier.
Correct.
So
correct.
Why not?
I mean, a lot of times in astrology, if all you know is where the cycles are and you are just not going to do anything about it at all, even just saying you wait out something, the cycle will change. And the pressure, whatever you're feeling, will change. And of course, that's not the ideal way to do it, but it's still the notion that it's cyclical, it keeps moving. And so being aware of that, it's like the idea that if you knew, yes, I am currently captured by the Pluto archetype, that's why, whatever, right? Then it's true now, but it won't be true in whatever period of time. Right?
That's right.
All right, well, do we continue?
Okay, thank you.
I look forward to the next deep exploration of some other archetype.
Right on. Okay, thanks.
All right. Great.